Hello, learners. Today we are going to talk about gender and what does an understanding of gender contribute to our practice, development practice, extension, and an understanding of community resource management. We have over the past few weeks been introducing the idea of gender, of working with groups, with men and women. But today we will really focus on some of the conceptual parts of what do we really mean by gender in the context, particularly of assets, agency, and empowerment. So, what we would like to do in today's lecture is really to answer three sets of questions. What do we understand by gender relations? Why is it important for development research and practice? And how can we understand gendered power relations in everyday life? So, first, to start with, what is gender? How do we define gender? So, it is not just about your sexual identity as a male or a female, but it is really a social construct that defines what it means to be a man or a woman, boy or a girl in a given society. So it carries specific roles, statuses, and expectations within households, communities, and cultures. So if you look at the picture on this slide, typically when we bring up our children, if it is a girl, then we give her dolls to play with as gifts. And if it is a boy, we give cars or trucks or guns to play with. And this connotes this is symbolic of what the expectations are of them as a girl or a boy. So when we talk about gender analysis or gender in analysis, there are a few things that we need to remember. First, as I just said, it is linked to biological differences of being a man or a woman, but it is not caused by biological differences. So if you look at the picture on the right, this is a tribal man in Koraput district of Odisha who is looking after his little children. He's doing a parenting, a caring function while his wife is busy with some other work. So there is nothing to stop men from taking on caring roles. But this is a social construct that it is the mothers or it is the women who are caring and the men are busy with their jobs or their work. So, second important element when we talk about gender, how do we understand gender within both our analysis and practice, is that it is shaped jointly by identity markers such as ethnicity, race, class, caste, religion, life course, sexualities, and so on. These identities mediate different forms of inclusion and exclusion. So, for instance, if you take a Dalit woman and an upper class or an upper caste woman, they both are women, but there will be differences in experiences depending on their social identity in terms of the resources to which they have access, the kinds of opportunities they have, the power relations in which they are embedded, and so on. So this is really the next point, that your social identity determines your access to resources, both property or labor market opportunities. So for instance, upper caste women may not be allowed to go to the market and work, whereas Dalit women or Adivasi women are totally accepted within markets. They're expected to be working. The next thing is that our understandings of gender relations and gender roles also varies across regions and cultures. So if I take a very contemporary example right now, if you see, let us say, Muslim women in India, where there is a Muslims are in a minority, in Bangladesh, where Muslims are in a majority, both these are democracies. And if you look at the Afghanistan today, which the Taliban has just taken control over and where they have decided that it will be a Sharia state. So these are Muslim women across these three different contexts. They have very different experiences. In the Indian context, there might be some limits on their ability to go out and work. In Bangladesh, we find that a majority of women are working, for instance, in the garment factories. If you go to Dhaka early in the morning, you will see women with their lunch boxes out in the street. And in the context of Afghanistan now, perhaps there will be a real complete limitation on women, on women's mobility and their ability to move and work. We will have to wait and watch. The other point is that gender relations also change over time and through an individual's life course. So let us see, when a child is young, as in this picture, girls and boys are treated equally. They can play, they can go to school in their parental home, and so on. When a young woman gets married and is a new bride in her in-laws' place, that's when a lot of the restrictions start. She has an immense burden of work and less freedom. By the time she has children, becomes a mother or a mother-in-law, I think again she has a lot of rights. So this is something that we need to remember about gender analysis. So a few key concepts that I'm going to take you through. The first one is really about gender roles, gender needs, and interests. Caroline Moser wrote in 1993 about the triple roles of women. Of course, these triple roles apply to men as well, and I will tell you how they are different. So first is the productive role, which is about production, whether it's farming, whether it is collection of forest produce, whether it is going for a job, and so on. The second type of work is reproductive work, which is really the caring tasks, the domestic work, maintenance of the household, fetching water, fetching fuel wood, and so on. And the third kind of work she called was community management. That when we live in communities, we all end up doing some kinds of tasks which are relevant to the community. Often for women, these are volunteering activities like supporting the school, cleaning up the area near the hand pump. Whereas when men do these roles, they tend to be much more formal and also at times paid, like they may have political leadership roles, leadership of the panchayats, and so on. The second side of gender analysis is really a very critical concept, which is about your needs and interests. And we differentiate between practical, that is those related to your immediate needs, everyday life. So if I need to collect water, if I don't have clean drinking water, this is an immediate real need which needs to be addressed. And something which is more strategic, which really challenges inequalities in gender relations. It seeks transformation. Like the picture I showed you. Why should it be only women's responsibility to take care of children? This doesn't require, actually, except for breastfeeding, any kind of biological role. This is a task that can equally be done, parenting, by men as well. The next issue is really about gender relations being embedded in social relations. And here I would like to say, come back to this point which I just made about the intersecting identities, that the way people are positioned in terms of each other, in terms of the resources that they have access to, in terms of the activities that they do, the power relations in which they are embedded, this is shaped by their multiple identities, whether it is caste, whether it is religion, and so on. Naila Kabir also makes an additional point that these social relations are not just at the household level. These gender relations are not just framed at the household level, but they exist at different levels of society. So you have gender relations at the community level, within markets like wage discrimination in labor markets, for instance. It sets the pace, it sets the choice about what are the activities women can do or women can't do. Because certain jobs are acceptable for women, certain jobs are not acceptable for women. Similarly, you have the whole legal framework or the policy domain or the state domain. What are the laws? Are they equal? Are they not equal? And I will give you some examples as we go along in terms of access to land, for instance, as a key resource. That while women may be cultivating land, they don't have equal access to land rights. And this may then pose some kind of inequality or barrier for them in order to be functioning independently in relation to that resource. So the next issue really comes to, after having seen these different levels in which gender relations are embedded, we then talk about power is very important concept in terms of gender relations. So Jo Rollins, basically in very simple terms, she said when we look at power, society is shaped by unequal power relations. The relationships between men and women are unequal. However, it is quite complex. It is not very straightforward. And she looks at 4 classifications of power. Power over, where you control somebody. This is what we typically see as the man controlling the woman or the landlord controlling the laborer and so on. This is relation of domination and subordination. The next kind of power is a more positive power. It is about having the power to influence or to change. And Michel Foucault, who was a French philosopher, he really spoke about power as a relational entity, that it doesn't exist in a vacuum. It is only when people are in relationships with each other that the issue of power comes. The third one is about power with or collective action, solidarity. And we will talk a little bit more about this when we talk about social change and transformation. And the fourth is a very subtle kind of power. It is the power within ourselves, the self confidence that we have, the self awareness. Do we realize that we are being subordinated or oppressed or embedded in unequal power relations? So, the way this works then, that if we look at it as a relationship, then it is a continuous process of negotiation, of contestation, of manipulation, and so on. And Joe Rollins goes further to say that power exists then at these multiple levels. When we talked about Naila Kabir's 4 levels of institutions, then in terms of levels of power also, you have the personal power, that at your level, in terms of your power within yourself, your agency, your ability to have friends, your ability to have time for yourselves. The next is the relational power. This could be with across genders. This could be across generations, with your parents or with your children or with your in-laws. It could be vis-a-vis NGOs. It could be vis-a-vis your teachers or academics. What is your ability to be heard, to negotiate, to communicate? This is very important. Do you just take everything quietly, or is there also a dialogue that goes on? This is very important part of the negotiation of power. And the third is really about group level or collective power for goals that cannot be achieved alone. It works at different levels, right, from the community and the village to the region or the country. For instance, if you take a case of domestic violence, one woman alone cannot change this. It has to be working at multiple levels, from the community level support to, indeed, a state level legislation in order to support or control the prevalence of domestic violence. So policy then becomes very important. And normally when we see how is power dealt with within policy approaches, you find a whole range from gender blind, that is implicitly male biased, which excludes women. So you assume that you do a program, let us say you provide credit cards for farmers or Kisan credit cards. You don't see what are the conditions attached to it. You assume that any farmer can access it. But women as farmers may not have certain key qualities or qualifications, like having land titles, which may debar them from accessing this resource. The second level, so these are called gender blind policies. Then you have gender neutral, where you realize that there is inequality, but whatever interventions you are doing or research you are doing, you don't really challenge this. You don't really question these inequalities. So if you take it for granted that women do all the care work, and you try to then understand that without really questioning that why is it that women do all the care work. The third level is improving, it's gender specific, where you realize that there are certain constraints. I spoke about the practical needs of women and men, that there are certain constraints that women or men may face to participation, and you try and address it. So, for instance, if women spend too much time collecting water, they don't have time to attend meetings, for instance, you may want to have an intervention which provides them with drinking water or a source of water very close to their home, so that they don't have to spend a lot of time collecting water, and this will free up some of their time for other tasks. So this is within the existing distribution of resources and responsibilities, but you try to make life easier by addressing some of the practical needs. The fourth level in policy approaches is gender sensitive, where you actually identify some of the inequalities, some of the challenges that are faced, and try and find ways in which these might be refigured or addressed. So, for instance, one thing might be paternity leave, for some days, to help men also, or the father also, to share with childcare work. The final level, which is our target really, is about gender redistributive or transformative approaches, where we address head on the inequalities in these power relationships, and we try and address it through the policies, through our action, in terms of the changing or challenging the existing distribution of resources and responsibility. So we may actively say, in a project I was doing in Indonesia, for instance, where a lot of the women are actually migrant workers, domestic workers to other countries, there are some interventions which are trying to make men more aware and actually take responsibility for the home and looking after the children and so on, while the woman is earning and remitting money back without necessarily depending on another female household member like a mother or a mother-in-law to do these tasks. So here we are really talking about the strategic interest, that how can we transform society, how can we transform relationships to become much more equal. So this takes me on really to an understanding of empowerment, which is a very common term used within development practice. We also spoke a little bit about this in block 1 when we were talking about participation and empowerment. What is it? It is really about making strategic life choices where you didn't have an ability. So ideally, the picture on the left is one which I really like, about a little schoolgirl. And we want to ensure that this girl is able to smile, is able to complete her education, and is able to have equal strategic chances, life choices, where in a rural context, she might, because of early marriage or other customs, be denied such an opportunity. That is the shift that we are talking about. That is the change process which we are talking about, which is an expansion of choices. What are the alternatives that are available, which are physically, materially, culturally possible? Here, I would like to clarify that when we talk about choices, we are talking about various kinds of choices. And here in empowerment, we're really talking about the strategic choices. So what I call as second order choices are everyday decisions. So what can we cook today? What can we have for lunch or dinner? This is not a strategic choice. We have to eat something, we have to cook something. But a strategic choice might be like an opportunity for this girl to complete her education, to get into employment, to go for higher studies, to choose when to get married, to whom to get married, when to have children, how many children to have. These are the strategic life choices. And we must recognize that there are inequalities depending on our social position in our capacity to make such choices. So if I am a Dalit woman with very little resources, actually my capacity to make choices is also limited. What this means then is that when we talk about empowerment as a process of change, this varies across place and time. It varies for differently positioned people. It is not a single process, but people shape their own processes of empowerment. Within development, when we talk about the empowerment approach, it is really about talking about these unequal power relations, making visible the unequal power relations that exist between men and women, but also between women and women and between men and women. Men, like I gave the example of a landlord and a laborer, or a mother-in-law and a daughter-in-law. They may be women, but they are in very different power positions. Here, there are two things which are very important, which have been noted by Sen and Groen when talking about third world feminism, that we need to distinguish, as I already did, between practical needs and the more strategic interests. And the second is we need to really shift from top down welfare and anti-poverty approaches to much more bottom-up approaches where we give value to people. We learn from the practical experiences of women and men, in fact, working for change at the grassroots level. And this is what we were speaking about when we talked about participatory approaches to extension. This is very much seen as empowering approaches or empowerment approaches. So Naila Kabir now has again written about measuring empowerment, and she talks about three kinds of elements which are involved in measuring empowerment and exercising choice. And this is resources, agency, and achievement. And I will talk about each of them in turn. What are the resources that we have access to, which may be material resources, human resources, social resources like networks, relationship with kin groups or landlords. Human is your level of education, perhaps, the skills that you have, and so on. Agency is about the processes of decision making, the types of decisions we make, the kinds of influence we have, and achievements are about the final outcomes in terms of, our health, our well being, level of education, housing, food, and so on. Now, all these three variables are interconnected and need to be seen together, as with similar resources, outcomes can be different. So, Kabir also says that there are certain qualifications to or constraints when we talk about empowerment. And what are these constraints? So, here we really talk about the structural context, that people are differently positioned and therefore they have different ability to make choices. Your preferences may vary. If you're an urban or a rural woman, if you're an upper caste or a Dalit or an Adivasi woman, what are the choices that you have? What are the preferences you have? And what are the values embedded in some of the choices you make? So I'll give you an example again from some of the work that I did in Western UP, where I was talking to a Jat household, and actually they had two daughters and a son. And when I got into conversation with the woman, it is true that they did do at one point a scan test to see that what was the sex of the child. And while the woman was very unhappy about this, she said that, in terms of status, if she didn't have a son, then it would be very difficult for her to survive in that household. And therefore, this was important to actually have this kind, to go with this, or to make that choice of going for that scan. Now, when you access new resources, you have some advantage because these are not a challenge. This is something new, but again, you can't predict the nature or the direction of change. One example is microfinance, that these are new set of resources, but it may be very empowering, but at the same time, if women get indebted, if they have a loss, if you have the collection agents who are constantly chasing them, it may also become quite oppressive. When we look at resources, it is really about a measure of the potential rather than actualized choice. For instance, these women are working on the land, they have access to land, but does it necessarily reflect that they are empowered? Do they have control over their land in terms of what crops to grow, whether they can sell the produce from that land? How far does it translate into their ability to take decisions about their land, and also in terms of outcomes, in terms of food security, in terms of income security, and so on. So resources here provide a potential for agency, but usually operationalized by the concept of control. And this is somewhat difficult to measure. So when we talk about the value of resources, I go back to the point that I raised earlier about the practical dimension of resources and the strategic dimension. So practical dimension has been called as instrumental use, for instance, of land, that where the World Bank said that land is a very useful resource for poverty reduction. If you have land, you can reduce poverty. Secondly, with men increasingly moving to non-farm activities, if women have land rights, then they will be able to cultivate land much more efficiently because they can take access to credit, other productive resources, and so on. And of course, land ownership also structures other social relations in terms of the labor you can access, the other resources, whether you can keep animals, livestock, and so on. But there is also a strategic dimension, which has been called as the equality dimension, which was embedded in many land reform programs, particularly tenancy reform programs in India, which basically sought that it is a principle of justice, of fairness, that everybody should have some land, not only for poverty reduction. And this kind of a rights or a justice framework was then propagated also by many international and national legislations and declarations and conferences, such as UN Conference on Women, Human Rights, Sustainable Development Goals, and so on. And here the idea is that since women constitute 50% of the population, they should be entitled to equal share of property. This will contribute to their empowerment and ability to challenge oppression. It becomes an issue then of rights. How do you define rights, however? Especially rights to resources like land. And here it is again complex, and it has been seen in the literature as a bundle of rights rather than one right. So to take the example of land, there can be a diversity of land types. So you can have agricultural land, you can have private land, you can have common property, which we also talked about when talking about sustainable livelihoods. You can have forest land. You can have different forms of rights, individual rights or community rights. You can have ownership, or you can have use rights, or you can have tenancy rights. Again, in many cases, there are different degrees of freedom. So I may have full rights to a land, but I may not be allowed to sell it. This often happens with our inherited property, that you have to take the permission of many members of the kin group before you can actually sell the land. There are different modes of acquiring land: through gift, through inheritance, through tenancy, through state transfer, or through purchase. And sometimes the purchased land is probably, you have complete control over it, whereas land which may be gifted or inherited, there may be much more regulation or control in terms of, or limitations in terms of what you can do with it. Again, the land maybe have different uses during different time periods. So there may be seasonal practices, there may be a fallow period, and so on. It varies in the case of gender, very interestingly, by age and marital status. So there are different rights that a daughter has, a wife has, a divorced woman or a widowed woman may have to that same plot of land. So then, if we look at these very various forms, these are all rights. But as you can see, there are different kinds of rights. So then we ask the question that, is it only about legal control and title, or will a range of access and use rights also be counted as rights, as access, as resources? And the UN Food and Agriculture Organization's voluntary guidelines on land tenure actually emphasizes the word legitimacy, that it is not only about legality, but when your access to that particular resource or asset is seen as socially legitimate, then that means that you have control, or you have some degree of control. So this is what they're arguing now for indigenous populations, or even for women, that if legal title is a problem, as long as the woman is working on that land, she should then be seen legitimately as an owner, as a farmer, and be entitled to all other kinds of resources and assets. This was something that was also argued in India within the national policy of farmers, which defined women as farmers, and it actually said that women therefore should be entitled to all other resources. The second dimension is about agency, and unpacking agency is very important. It is really about the ability to define one's goals and act upon them. It is again very complex, as the process of decision making is not straightforward in terms of where you influence. As I said, power itself is complex, so agency is also complex. It can vary with the type of work. So if it is about working in the labor market, women's voice may be much less. But if it is anything to do with education or reproductive work or domestic management, then women may be much more engaged. I will again give you an example from Uttar Pradesh. Very poor household, but childcare was seen as women's responsibility, and the woman really argued with her husband that the child should be put into a private school, which had a high fee, and they had to take a huge loan. But the husband agreed, even though he was seen as the productive worker. Similarly, there are different dimensions of decision making. As I said, a very strategic decision making about personal lives, marriage, fertility, number of children to have. It could be about financial provisioning, running the household, bringing up the children, and so on. And here, women's positionality, whether she is a mother, whether she's a wife, whether she's a daughter, these become very critical in the types of decisions that are taken. Again, going back to some of our early concepts about social relations and social institutions, that there is a link between institutions and women's ability to act. So, for instance, now with a lot of men migrating out of rural areas, women are able to go to banks, they are able to go to agricultural training, extension officers, and so on, because the context has changed. The men are not available anymore. And importance again of collective power and collective agency in shifting some of these social norms. So it's just some very small examples, everyday examples of agency, of how women act. If they are not consulted, as I said, they may not necessarily argue, but how do they manipulate? How do they negotiate? If there is a cropping decision that has been taken without her consent, I have seen women in Santhal Parganas, Santhal women actually withdrawing their labor and saying they were not consulted and they have to grow another crop. Similarly, there may be negotiations at community level about what resources, how to use resources, about land use. You may talk to outsiders, like many women would talk to me or to other agents about their problems in order to shame some of the men, some of the leaders, and make them act in favor of women's rights. Similarly, collective action has also been very visible about inclusion of women's names in land records, ensuring entitlements for widows. So there is the whole single women's network in India, which has been working for the rights of widows and separated women. How do we have much more decentralized and localized land management systems, maybe through the panchayat, which can recognize women as farmers and give them rights? How do we include women in decision-making bodies like panchayats? And then collective level, for instance, when displacement by the state for a particular project, how can we address that issue? Finally, we come to achievement. And achievement is really about the impacts, which can be tangible and intangible, direct and indirect. For instance, a tangible impact is increased wages, whereas an intangible impact may be increased bargaining power. It is about power within and increased bargaining power. Similarly, a direct and indirect change may be about increased income versus a reduced reliance on moneylenders. A second kind of achievement can be to ask the question that have women stepped out of routine forms of behavior? I have been emphasizing about women's roles and women's positionality as mothers, as wives, as daughters. So sometimes, for instance, where women go for child immunization to the health center, they're going outside their home, and it is improving well-being outcomes definitely in terms of child immunization and child health. But here women are acting in their role as mothers and in their reproductive roles or care roles. Whereas if women decide that they want to go for contraception, or they want to not have a child because it may put their own lives at risk, then here it is really about acting in their own interests as wives, as women. So the effect, while both are positive achievements, child immunization, child health, but the second kind of achievement where women are really thinking about their own interests is much, much more strategic and transformatory. And thirdly, how do we interpret some of these indicators? As I said, context is very important. So where women's market-related work or employment may be seen as a sign of empowerment because they are earning an income, it could also have a connotation which is negative in terms of increasing women's work burdens, reducing their leisure, and in fact, letting men off the hook or letting men off responsibility by women taking on all responsibility. So I would just like to conclude this with key elements of gender analysis, which is we resist the notion that women are a homogeneous group with no difference by age, class, caste, or other identities. We question dominant narratives about male and female roles in the economy, recognizing that productive and reproductive contributions to household livelihoods are different. Thirdly, we need to remember that gender relations are dynamic and they change over time. They can be ambiguous. So we need to be sensitive also with changing male roles, difficulties, and male identities, as we saw during the pandemic and the lockdown, that a lot of these migrant men were stuck in destinations without food, without shelter, walking back home, and so on. So we really need to look at gender relations as dynamic and recognize the role of power relations in shaping access to resources, income, and rights, and very importantly, clarify the context of the study, including which women and men are its subjects. So I would like then to conclude, learners, with this brief summary that gender is a very important part of our social relations, of our everyday lives. We therefore need to be aware of what are the inequalities. Once we are aware of the inequalities, once we are aware of the challenges, we can also take action to change these circumstances. These are not immutable, and this is what gives us hope. So thank you very much, and I look forward to carrying forward this discussion with you.